Welcome to A State of Mind. This is Julian Royce. Today's episode is a great one. It's one that I put more preparation into than a lot of them and have been planning for a long time. Today I'm speaking with my friend Braxton Dudley. Braxton is a fellow therapist here in Boulder, Colorado, who offers counseling and contemplative coaching. He focuses on somatic parts work, relationship, and spiritual issues. And he's also a fellow meditator who's done a number of meditation retreats, as he shares in our conversation. And the subject of our conversation is around attachment theory. Attachment theory is a really crucial part of contemporary psychology and a lot of counseling and therapy, and it touches on so many important aspects of our lives. And so this conversation is intended to be both an introduction as well as a deeper dive into the subject. And I did my best in the show notes below to list the different topics we discuss in the order we discuss them. And I articulate some of the terminology, which can be a little bit confusing because the words for the different attachment styles in the research literature is different for infants and children than it is for adults. So I hope you enjoy and appreciate this conversation. It may be one worth visiting again or pausing at certain moments to take it in. There's a lot of information and insights and techniques and things that get shared here. So without further ado, I bring you Attachment Theory with Braxton Dudley. So I'm here today with Braxton Dudley. Braxton, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
It's really good to be here.
Yeah.
Been looking forward to this for a few weeks now.
Yeah.
Since we got it in the calendar.
We have been planning this for a while.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we know each other from a meditation retreat with Soaking Rinpoche.
Yes, yeah.
Many years ago. And I think I first met you at a meditation weekend at Naropa University a long time ago.
Yeah, the first time I remember is, who is that Hindu dude who's also a lama? Who was part of the Neem Curly Baba scene with Ram Dass, but then was also a Dzogchen teacher. Forget his name. He wrote the book, Lama Surya Das.
Lama Surya Das, yeah.
So I met you,
that
was the first time I saw you and pegged you on my radar. And that was like 5 years ago at least.
Yeah. And he's actually a really good comedian. He was telling jokes, right?
Yeah, he was great. He was a fun vibe. Cool dude.
Yeah, and then I saw you at Soaking Rinpoche retreat. He's another great meditation teacher. And then we both went to Naropa University. And you graduated, 2 years ago?
Something like that, yeah. This is not this summer. Last summer was the first time I was starting private practice. So
great, yeah.
Went straight in.
Fellow therapist and meditation teacher.
Yeah. Still starting to own the fact that I teach meditation. It's
I know, it sounds like
slow side effect of what shows up in my counseling business. And also some people end up will come to me for therapy, and yet we end up doing more meditation stuff. I had one person totally switch to just guided meditations, us meditating together, and then sometimes blending in counseling, but it's so unique based on what each person wants.
Totally. I think mindfulness meditation is partly a matter of semantics, what we call things, but if you're really learning mindfulness and meditation, you're learning how to work with your own mind. And so you're giving people tools and skills and practices that they can develop and carry throughout their whole life. And to me, that's incredibly valuable. So good work.
As well as working with their body.
Yeah, that's true.
Being aware of their body, their posture. And, I just finished a sensory motor psychotherapy training, which you also did, which we've talked about. And I felt like that was just how to guide meditation in the context of psychotherapy, and with the intention of getting deeper insight into how you organize experience or how you create your perception of yourself and others and world. And it just seems so similar yet also different than more traditional Buddhist paths or other contemplative paths that I've explored. It's
a little less soteriological emphasis, if I'm using that word correctly.
I don't know. I don't even know that word.
Less emphasis on achieving some kind of enlightenment or nirvana, and more on how you are in the world. But I think I get into trouble, and I'm glad you made that point when I use the word mind.
Yeah.
From my point of view, I'm speaking about consciousness, which includes our body, which includes our energy, which includes everything, includes the whole world.
Yeah,
but often the word mind is used in a way of like mind versus body versus objects in the world, or whatever it is.
Totally.
And it's good for me to remember that when I'm speaking to people.
Totally.
Like I called my company A State of Mind, and the podcast A State of Mind. But to me, that really means consciousness, or awareness.
Yeah. And that's much more influenced by the Tibetan understanding of the word mind.
Yeah.
And then when you use mind in Advaita Vedanta or Kashmir Shaivism context, it means more of the mental sphere, which is interesting.
It's good to make those distinctions too. It's just in English, we don't have a long tradition of like really defining these different terms. So totally get that mind can mean just thoughts or mentalizing or concepts or something like that. But it can mean a lot more than that too. So.
Yeah.
And so we're here today with an emphasis on attachment. We're going to talk about attachment theory, and it's something you've been studying a lot in a lot of depth. And so looking forward to hearing your download about this.
Yeah, so attachment, for those not familiar, it's more about how we show up in relationships. Our relationship styles, and people don't realize it, but it's also very connected to your sense of competence in exploring things that are meaningful to you. And that has been, a theme in my life. And once I realized that attachment styles weren't just about our relationships, it was also sort of about, our pursuit of life. It just made me realize how important it was. And also, we have relationships almost no matter where we go, unless you're like, living in a cave or very rural area and working by yourself. It's like we have relationships at work. We have relationships with our peers and our friends, and we have romantic partnerships, which evoke so much of our early childhood history, as well as it being transgenerational.
That's a good point.
We are most likely to have the same attachment styles as our primary caregivers. So before I go too much into that, we should probably go over the styles.
Yeah.
Brief overview.
Well, and just briefly, the point about, if there's a person alone in a cave somewhere, they're still in relationship with themselves, the parts of themselves, the water they eat, the food, the sun, the moon, like the earth. I mean, so I think it's worth deconstructing something like relationship. Like I just feel like we're in relationship with everything all the time, right?
Totally. And I think in some degree, certain attachment styles are more willing to relate with non-human objects. So then you get into objects relation theory, which is a whole different, related trajectory, but I don't know as much about object relation. But certain attachment styles tend to be more averse to being in human relationships, where others, and they relate more to objects, where others might relate more to humans. Some might prefer animals because humans don't feel safe. Yeah. But animals have been a supportive being. So we're in relationship with everything. I'm not actually quite sure how attachment affects all of object relation theory, though.
It's a good question.
It is.
I guess if we want to go that far, we could even go into the realm of spirits or gods or goddesses.
Oh, those are very relevant. The experience of them. I'll go more into that when we start talking about how to actually repair certain attachment challenges with the different styles, because you'll literally use those visualizations of protector figures or ideal parent figures is actually an entire modality of attachment repair. And Diane Poole Heller, who's an expert in the field, for people who are disorganized, they tend to visualize protectors coming in and saving them from traumatic events that led to certain attachment ruptures.
That's fascinating.
And soothing them. And so it's very similar to the ideal parent figures, but I think why it's worth knowing all this is because we are relational beings who have to interact with other relational beings. And when we understand our own attachment style, we can actually actively engage it. And when we understand how other people's attachment styles are, like I know it's really helped some of my friendships because, if I know someone's dismissive and they have a history of their needs not being their relational needs not mattering at all and being secondary to the others. I actually remember being in a conflict with a friend who, I was frustrated with, and he had stuff come up, and because I knew his attachment style and his history of, in conflict, him needing to, not have relational needs and it being all about the other, I was like, well, why don't you talk to me first about how that experience was for you? And offered some just sense of like, yeah, what you experience matters too. I did that specifically because I knew his attachment style.
You noticed that, yeah.
And I knew what his style needed for some sort of corrective experience. And so when conflict comes up with my friends or my girlfriend or even family, like, and I wish I had known this earlier when I was working in more communal environments, because being a therapist, it's more one-on-one.
Right.
But, that's like the crux of, it's like underlying everything I do with my therapy, along with some other things like parts work.
Yeah.
So we also can benefit greatly from understanding how our early childhood relationships with our primary caregivers impact our relationships today.
I love that. That's such an important point, and so it's good for people to know that.
Yeah, and so even though it's in the past, the impact of the past still resonates through the present.
Yes.
And then unfolds into the future. And so...
Yeah, it doesn't mean that we can't be free in the present and can't make new choices and learn and grow. It doesn't mean we're victims of the past. It doesn't mean we blame everything on our parents and all that stuff, but it matters. It affects us. It informs who we are and how we show up.
Totally. And it can just help us understand how we got the way we did.
Right.
And also maybe even how our parents got the way they did, and sort of understanding that attachment isn't just a single generational thing. It's multiple generations. And like I said, you're most likely to have the attachment of your primary caregiver, or plural. You might have different attachment styles in different contexts.
That's another important point.
Yeah.
You have different attachment styles in different contexts. So if we were going to define attachment style, how would you want to, like if someone's listening, like, what does that even mean?
Yeah. So I would say it is the underlying perceptions you have about yourself and other, and how to show up in relationship. So...
the underlying perceptions you have. And so they could be not always conscious. You're not always conscious of them, right?
Yeah. They're mostly unconscious or implicit is how they're talked about in the literature. And it's more right brain oriented. And they start to develop by 2 years. You start to have a more solid attachment style. And from 2 years, some of the literature says 75 to 85% chance to die with the attachment style you had at 2 years old.
Wow.
And so we can have a primary style and then sub-styles in different contexts. So I think now might be a helpful time to go into the different styles, unless you have a follow-up question.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think, why don't we name the different styles and then go into them more, and then if you wanted to share a little bit of the history with it, I think that could be a little bit of background, because there were some fascinating experiments and studies.
Oh, yeah. And it's actually a part of what helps tease out different styles. So very briefly, I also want to say I'm going to use the adult attachment names, and I'll also say what the child one was at first. But it's very weird they have different names to describe the same attachment styles.
That's an important point. That's part of what makes the literature confusing.
Yeah. And so there's 4. There is secure, which you could say is you grew up with caregivers that were loving, supportive in your exploration. They were safe, reliable. And the other thing is, when there was rupture, there was opportunity for repair. So... and what's interesting is they found through a study, which I'll go into more in a second, that you only had to show up 30% of the time from a secure place in order to have some aspects of secure in your system.
Yeah, and I love that for all the parents out there, for everyone. Like, it's okay to be human. Like, we're not perfect. And
No.
if you're a caregiver and you show up well, 30, 40% of the time, like, that can be good enough, right?
I just said no, but I meant no to, we don't have to be perfect. Like, no, that is not how we have to be. Just to clarify.
And the secure is sometimes called an anchor, quote unquote.
Yeah, and that's in Stan Tatkin's couples therapy model. As a children, it's secure in all of them as well, child and adult. And the other thing, too, is you won't get secure if everything works out all the time. Without ruptures, there actually isn't the opportunity to learn repair and have a security that pervades both things going well and things not going well. Mm-hmm. So that's a deeper security than, everything was great all the time and nothing ever went wrong. Actually, there's an insecurity of knowing how to navigate our humanness, which is imperfect. So,
I like that.
I think there's a deeper security in learning to, work through ruptures. And that's something later on in collaborative relationships as adults that helps people who are insecure or disorganized get earned secure attachment. And so the next two attachment styles are in the category of insecure styles. So that would mean there's two main ones. Anxious, ambivalent is the child name, which is preoccupied as the adult, and avoidant and dismissive. So avoidant children become dismissive adults. So with anxious, preoccupied attachment styles, just very roughly and quickly, it's people tend to be more insecure in their exploration. They tend to be more in the fight or flight activation in the nervous system in relationships. Many are described more as clingy in relationships. I want to name some strengths after I go through some of what they struggle with. They tend to struggle with self-regulation. So they regulate in relationships, so they tend to need a lot of proximity to different people. So actually the strength of that is they tend to be more relational. They tend to have lots of friends. Sometimes those friendships are more emotionally charged, or the other thing is they tend to have trouble calming down, which I'll outline in a study. And there can be an element of demandingness in their relationships when they get triggered. And so that hinders the collaboration of your needs and my needs. So that's what sort of hinders some of that collaborative relationship skill that creates security in adult relationships. That's also the style that I more identify with, that I had to work through. The challenges I had to work through, along with some disorganization, I would say, which I'll go into in a minute. But I'm going to look at my notes real quick. The other thing is, the reason it's called preoccupied in adults is because they are preoccupied with the other person's mind state. So they tend to be focused more on the other than themselves. They tend to self-sacrifice in relationship. And we can go more into detail later, or I actually feel like this is a good riff, and we could come back to secure if you want to go more into depth. What is your thoughts?
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I just remembered the other thing. So I'll restate some of what I shared in more depth later. So the dismissive is the next, insecure attachment style. And so they tend to be more dismissive in relationships, emotional needs of people. They tend to be more cognitive. They tend to not be have as many close relationships. They may have relationships related to whatever activity they're into or their hobby. But like we were saying earlier, they're more focused on the objects versus people.
So
their career.
Could this be someone who's like a kind of more of a lone wolf kind of figure?
Lone wolf would be one expression.
Yeah.
They could also be very social, but it's more, they regulate alone. They actually feel more dysregulated in relationships. So they were measuring people's vitals and different things, and they found that people who were dismissive felt more anxiety when in connection with someone, where people who were preoccupied actually relaxed.
Oh, interesting.
Where secure felt more regulated in both away and with people.
Yeah. That's an important point.
Yeah. And so they might seem cold or aloof in relationship more often. And I'll go more into depth after we go through the studies, because it'll really make more sense once we go into the studies of how these styles developed. Disorganized tended to have had either extremely neglectful or abusive caregivers. And notice I said tended to. You can also, because this is transgenerational often, if you had a parent that was abused or neglected severely and had disorganization, and they didn't perpetuate that in a major way, then the child might inherit that. And that's because with someone who's disorganized, the source of their nourishment, the source of their attachment, was also their source of threat. And so their fight or flight system, along with their attachment function, actually wired together. So it's a relational trauma. And by trauma here, I'm defining it as a threat to one's life, or a sense of their life being threatened.
Even if it's not quote-unquote real, it feels that way.
Yeah.
And so part of what you're saying is a parent who has disorganized attachment, who has this early trauma, even if they're a really good parent and they're consciously not doing anything abusive or wrong, that could still be passed on to the child transgenerationally. Yeah,
and that's because when the child attunes to the parent and the parent's nervous system activates, so that fight or flight is wired into the attachment function, and that sense of life threat gets activated. And when the parent is tuning to the child starts to pick up on that because they're very sensitive babies. And then their fight or flight gets activated because mom or dad is, or a caregiver is activated. And so then their fight or flight system starts to wire with their attachment function. So in that way, they never experience the direct abuse or neglect. But because their parent was fearful of them, they experience a fearfulness wired into their attachment function.
Yeah, that's amazing. And could that then be passed on to that person's children?
Potentially.
And so keep going for a while.
I'll just disclose, I feel my mom has elements of disorganized, and through events that she had, both in childhood and adulthood, also the failure to intervene with traumatic experiences. So you can grow up in a mainly preoccupied caregiver, or a mix of a dismissive father with a preoccupied mother, and then if we just brush under a major trauma under the rug, that actually can start to create a lack of protection for the child, and that can start to create the same experience of, oh, these relationships aren't actually safe, even if they seem like they were safe, or they were safe to some degree, but when I actually need protection, they don't intervene. That can start to create some disorganization as well. So, but primarily very entrenched disorganization versus pockets of disorganization in someone's development, where their dominant style is disorganization, tended to have neglectful or abusive caregivers. And so for me, since my mom didn't reenact any of, the experiences that she had in childhood or teenagehood, growing up as a woman and all these things, since she didn't actually reenact any of that trauma with me, I felt some of the disorganization I worked through was more inherited, felt transgenerational, and that space from the original trauma actually felt like it was a little bit easier to heal than if, say, my mom was abusive or something. And, it's interesting. I actually have a relationship with my grandfather that I find difficult. And I think part of it's connected to what I feel inside me, like coming through.
Yeah.
It's some of, like, just as a child, I was just very sensitive to him, and immediately, like, later I learned some of the history, and I'm like, oh, that's so interesting.
Oh, wow.
I didn't know cognitively, but it's like something in my body knew a deeper history.
You could feel something, yeah. That's fascinating.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. I mean, one thing it brings up for me is, like, these attachment styles aren't right or wrong. They're not something to judge each other about. Right? It's something that, like, at the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about understanding, understanding. When you understand why you are the way you are, why other people are the way they are, then it's just the judgment goes out the window, and it's more like, oh, okay, that makes sense. Like, they arose for good reason.
Yeah, they rose for good reason.
And now we have a chance to change them.
We do. And there are certain, like, extremes where if you start to see them, like, you may actually realize, oh, that's probably not going to work for me.
In terms of being in a relationship with someone?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Which maybe will come up.
Get to that, yeah.
Actually, but there's so much to unpack with the styles. I wouldn't be shocked if, like, I feel like I could easily use 2 podcasts or 3, to talk about it. But for the last thing with disorganized is, I just want to emphasize, is really learning. They have trouble with both, like, self-regulating, but also feeling regulated around others, so that they can have a push-pull, because, like you were saying, these were healthy adaptive functions for the environments that we were experiencing.
Yeah.
So if you grow up with a caregiver who's abusive and your source of threat, but also your source of nourishment, being able to push them away, but then if they get too far away, knowing to get closer. Like,
actually makes sense.
And how to stay in proximity in a safe way. That is a healthy function. Like, I'm so glad that people who grew up in those environments were able to develop disorganized attachment. I wish they never developed it in the first place, but I honor how they were able to survive very difficult experiences.
Yeah.
And that's part of healing the shame, because disorganized attachment can be very, it can often correlate with what people call personality disorders, like borderline. And, I view borderline more as probably a traumatic response. I kind of don't jive with a lot of the personality disorder stuff. Or don't know where I stand on some of them too, but borderline, historically more women were diagnosed with borderline than men.
Yeah.
And even in some research where they had the same prompt but just a different, gender, the people would get diagnosed with, who are men, would get diagnosed with PTSD, where that same prompt with just a gender difference would get diagnosed with borderline personality disorder in a statistically significant way.
Jeez.
So one, viewed as trauma, we can heal it, it takes time. The other, this is unchanging, you are just crazy. This is a personality thing.
Yeah.
And
I think borderline can be worked with, and just for people listening out there, DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, is a great modality to work with borderline issues. I view all that stuff as spectrums that we're all have some part of, and some of us have a lot more of. But to that point of, like, our attachment systems are something that are hardwired into us at a young age so that we survive. So it's part of our evolutionary heritage, and it's a good thing, and we need them in order to survive. And so they that perspective of we develop these different styles to survive in different environments with different caregivers. And then
and I think there's a lot of healing shame that I find in this, not just shame for myself, but, like, knowing our parents often did the best they could with what they learned from their caregivers.
Right.
So there's, in some sense, a lineage of trauma, but there's also a lineage of healing often where, if I look at some people's, like, parents and how their parents were with their grandparents were with their parents, I was like, oh, there's clearly some growth happening, some healing. Or something happened, and it's so complex. But, I think also recognizing for me that I could never be given from my parents what they did not get. And just sort of having some compassion of, like, I struggled a lot growing up. I actually ended up dropping out of high school
Oh, wow.
And I, you know, I think that's some of why I identify with disorganization is I had trouble exploring what was meaningful, but I also had difficulty in relationships. And, you know, in doing some of my healing work, which I feel like at this point after years and years of doing attachment work, I'm starting to embody more of earned secure with pockets of preoccupation, and then every now and then I get a little bit of disorganization. And that hasn't really popped up in quite a while. But every now and then when I'm doing some inner work, I'll come to a disorganized part of myself and like, oh, I forgot you were in there. I didn't realize that.
Thanks for sharing that. So part of what you're sharing is different parts of yourself, so to speak, could have different attachment styles.
That's my sense of different contexts bring out different attachment styles.
That's fascinating.
And often in high school, right before I dropped out, I felt what people describe disorganization as was more my dominant experience. Where now I'm in a pretty secure relationship. I've never had a relationship as easygoing as mine is. I've never expected it to go well. I've never been able to actually feel and receive the love from my partner as in the way I have now. And that took years of work. Like these subtle, implicit attachment styles are referred to as internal working models. So our working models of relationships and of ourselves, like they were grown before cortical functions were really online much. And so these need to be healed implicitly. These need to be actually go into the procedural memory, which is through visualizations. It's more of an inward movement. You know, having healthy corrective relationships now can also create attachment repair. So like a mentor can actually create a pocket of security for a child that is like experiencing a lot of abuse or neglect. You know, and I've heard a disorganized client of mine like share that. You know, how a particular teacher,
that's beautiful.
How a friend's father really showed up for them. You know, and it just gave them this sense of like, oh, there's more possible in relationships that later they could go back and revisit and amplify in therapy of that security, and then start to be like, oh yeah, I can look for people like that.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, a mentor, a teacher relationship can provide that model, that inner knowing, that felt sense of a healthy, more secure relationship and what's possible and what it can offer. And that's beautiful. One thing I wanted to add based on what you were saying earlier is if you have inherited, and I think to some degree we all are, we inherit trauma from the past. There's so much trauma in the world today. It's such a powerful perspective for me to take that now's actually a chance, an opportunity for me to heal some little bit of that. And not pass it on to my own kids if I have them, or other people that I interact with.
And I am so on this transgenerational kick. And implicit or feeling memories. So we can have memories that are emotional memories, body memories. We can have memories that are more cognitive in imagery or remembering the past. But if we had things in childhood, like as a baby, that visual and self-reflective memory wasn't yet online. So the body is going to remember those things, not the mind. And then also if it's transgenerational, we aren't going to necessarily, unless we're lucky, have the memories of our ancestors. And, you know, I've had pockets of that in certain altered states and stuff where that's come up through retreat or medicines or something like that. But, you know, I don't know if those are reliable or not. But
it almost doesn't matter, right, if they're quote unquote objectively true. It's like some information is being experienced and there's a chance for it to be healed.
Right? And I think those experiences can create some left brain, right brain integration. And which helps with healing trauma and attachment. And trauma. And attachment wounds are just relational trauma and how we coped with them, and how our ancestors coped with them. And one study I just want to, before we jump into the attachment studies I want to name, is with this transgenerational traumas. Have you heard of the 7 generations of mice?
I'm not sure if I have.
So it's a study where they took rose essential oils in mice and they shocked the mice to the rose essential oil smell. Until the mice would enter fight or flight just to the scent of the rose essential oil.
Kind of like a mean version of Pavlov's dog.
Exactly. They then tested the next generation of mice, and without any shock, the rose essential oil sent the mice into fight or flight.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
For 7 generations, there was measurable activation from this rose essential oil.
Oh.
So even though 7 generations, and that's crazy. I mean, think 7 generations, like how many people have migrated? How many people have had extreme major traumas? And like, so it's possible without, for 7 generations to pass
amazing.
through.
Yeah. I'm really curious about we don't have to get all into it now, but the genetic component of that it could be observed in our genetic code potentially, or the way our genes show up. And if we wanted to do an experiment on transgenerational trauma with a certain group of people, we could look to the Jewish people. It's like pretty good case study, right?
Yeah, and lots of...
So for all my Jewish listeners out there, I mean, there's been so much, that genetic line, for however you want to talk about, it's been kept, pretty closely. I mean, you can... If you take a DNA test, you can see if you have any Jewish ancestry or not, and then there's just been an incredible amount of trauma over hundreds or I guess thousands of years, really. So
and I think of plenty of marginalized populations too. That's a generational thing, and it's interesting. In some of my own work with that, I have come into parts that feel an immense perpetrator energy in me, and I don't know what happened or where it came from. But having to process this perpetrator energy was very intense for a little while.
Oh, wow.
And, I come from, I'm about as white as it can get, in America, in the land we're at, where it was seized, like, unwillingly.
Yeah.
And, we can trace my family back to, like, pilgrims and early, like, people who came over and colonized this land. There's some connection to tobacco in my family.
Oh, wow.
It's very interesting.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, if there's a connection with tobacco, historically, there's probably a connection with slavery.
Yeah. And so there is in doing some of my inner work and journeying, I had to work through perpetrator energy and the trauma of causing harm, which I don't think is the same as receiving harm. But just for people who are doing that work out there, it's like, wow, it was actually, like, intense for me to confront those energies in myself. And I get curious if there are ways they perpetuate themselves today, and have historically, like, looked into that as it comes up.
That's an interesting perspective on that.
It's subtle,
yeah,
but significant.
Yeah, super significant.
So the transgenerational thing is important because attachment isn't just us. It isn't just today. It's implicit memories we got from our grandparents, from our parents. It's, if we're adopted, the moment of, like, a baby can tell when their caregiver's gone and there's a new one that they hadn't been attaching to for 9 months in the belly. So certain people who are, there's so much unconscious and so much that isn't thinking that is a part of attachment. And so if people start doing this work and they don't cognitively know and things like that, that's fine. That might actually be good information that you don't have a cognitive recognition. And that doesn't mean we can't work with it. That doesn't mean that it can't transform. That doesn't mean you need to understand cognitively for things to shift. Like, you can just start to embody what is coming up for you as you do your work, and start to, emanate the qualities of secure attachment to those parts coming up, even if you don't have this cognitive recognition.
Yeah, I love that.
It may not be you.
That's powerful. Yeah.
It may not be your part.
Right. I guess on that subject, we can wrap it up, but I think all of us, if we go into our ancestry, like, we all have perpetrators and victims back for thousands of years. So it's not, I don't want to endorse an overly simplistic view of history that there's, like, this one group that did this or this one group, because it's all, we were all fighting wars and doing different things. And you can if you read the Old Testament, you will see just with the Jewish example, the Jewish people actually genociding these other people and all these horrible stories in them. So it's an amazing history that we all carry, and then it ultimately doesn't matter, like, whose fault. Like, if we have a chance to heal some of that in ourselves, like, that's beautiful, powerful work that we can all do now. So.
Yeah, for me, it's pragmatic of just, like, what leads to healing.
Right.
And and there's victim energy in me too. And,
like, we all contain all of it if we go deep enough. That's my kind of frame on it.
Totally. And I think honoring what is real and what's coming up here and now. Because there are more relevant contexts, Like I mean, I don't know any of the details of my own family, but, you know, I sense there's some healing to be done somewhere, and I don't know where it is. But, you know, and that starts to get more in the spiritual realm, which I don't want to go too much into right now, because I want to talk more about attachment. But that 7th generation of mice really started to, in understanding that we have feeling memories that aren't cognitive, and how much attachment styles developed before cognitive stuff came online, and how healing attachment deals more with that than just, you know, reframing our experience or working with cognition.
Yeah.
Because people can know a lot about attachment, and then they still, you know, end up enacting patterns and haven't actually done the implicit work.
And so when you say implicit work, implicit memory, the way I understand that is it shows up through our felt sense within our body in the present moment, but its source may be something from the past, maybe when we were a baby or a child, attachment stuff, or caregivers, but we access it in the present through our felt sense in our body, and that's actually a chance to help heal that or rewire that or work with it. Okay.
Yeah. And trying to orient what would be most helpful. I'm not keeping track of time at all.
You were gonna share a little bit about some of the experiments.
So just one thing, and then I think fleshing out more of the attachment styles, and how to work with them in yourself. And one helpful framework for understanding how to target different aspects of attachment I'm going to go into.
Yeah.
So John Bolby was the person that founded attachment, and he was coming out of a very Freudian era, which was using, what's that sexual energy libido.
Yeah, the libido.
You know, they were talking about libido drives and how that relates to caregivers, and that's the source of how people show up in relationships.
Oedipal complex and electro complex.
All around sexual stuff. So Bolby was actually pretty revolutionary in starting to create more what we see of today, represented in counseling and psychotherapy and psychology.
He was in London in the 40s and 50s, is that?
I actually don't remember the exact dates. I used to, and
I think that's correct. Yeah.
Since then have stopped looking at it. But Bolby came up with the term internal working model and came up with secure, you know, I think anxious and avoidant. And I think he was mainly studying kids. And then
I think he actually started studying children during and after World War II in England, because many children were sent away from their families to keep them safe during the bombing.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
And he was like, I wonder how that's affecting them.
Totally.
He started discovering this attachment stuff.
The orphanages in Russia and stuff were a big part of those experiments. And I need to review some of my history, because I'm starting to notice it's fallen away with dates. But what I thought was interesting, so Bolby didn't actually have any experiments. He came up with a theory, but he didn't come up with ways of measuring the theories. And that was actually one of his students, Mary Ainsworth. She created the strange situation experiment that is like Psychology 101 course. So Mary Ainsworth, and it ends up outlining how attachment styles develop so well. So Mary Ainsworth there would be a therapist, the primary caregiver, which at the beginning was primarily mothers, and Western, and this happened all in a Western context, and so they would bring the babies in with the mother, and there would be a play area, and they were measuring the baby's capacity to explore as well as their signals for attachment. And so it's around 1.5 years, 2 years they were experimenting with babies. And I won't go into all the longitudinal studies, but then they started to study those babies' kids and how it transitions through generations and things like that. But so 2 things they explored: exploration and attachment in relationships. And these are very important for identifying, attachment styles. So with a secure child, they would come in, the baby would sit down, or they would have the mother and baby sit down. They would see how they would react. There would be bids for attention. They would see the play area. They would go and play. and then they would turn back at the mom and check to see if it was safe. And so there was still the attachment function even while they were exploring. But they would actively explore. The mother would leave the room. The baby would be upset.
Right.
And the therapist would come in. There would be some interaction with the therapist. They might calm down some. They might not calm down too much, but the mother would come in and be able to soothe the child. So you can see there was the capacity for rupture and repair. There was the capacity for exploration and attachment. And you could see the attunement between the mother and the child. So that's secure. So with preoccupied, which was anxious, ambivalent child, the mother and the child would come in. The child would tend to be clingy towards the mother, and sometimes, or often, a little agitated. And then they typically would stay and cling towards the mother instead of going and exploring. When the mother left, they were totally distraught. And then sometimes they actually paused the experiments because they were so concerned about the child. And the therapist would come in, and also the therapist would come in while the mother was in there. So it wasn't just after. So the mother would leave. The child would not be consoled or really interact with the therapist at all. And then when the mother came in, it was extremely difficult for them to relax the child. So, and that often was the sense of reliable support. So preoccupation often is born out of a lack of reliability, which we'll go more into. So the baby isn't calming down because they don't know if the support's even reliable. It's a part of that. But also their attachment function is hyperactivated. They tend to be more emotionally driven children. So hyperactive attachment function and an underactive exploration function.
And that's connected with the lack of reliability from the caregiver?
Yeah, lack of reliability, preoccupation from the mother or primary caregiver. At the time, they were studying mothers when this first started. So they may be attuned to all these other things and missing the child, but they love their child and they come in and sometimes provide the adequate support needed, and emotional needs aren't shut down. And this grows up later into having to track the caregiver to see how to get their needs met. Where the dismissive you will see is a little different. With the dismissive in this experiment, the mother and baby came in. The baby was less interested in the mother. I mean, they would interact some, but the baby would then explore and often not be connected to the mother in their exploration. The mother would leave. There wouldn't be that much of a reaction. They may interact some with the therapist, but or the researcher, but then the mother came in, and there often wasn't much consoling to do, and they would just keep exploring, kind of ignoring the mother a little. So, what you can see.
That's fascinating. So the baby would not seem in need of consoling.
Yeah.
But I've heard that if you measure the vital signs, the pulse and stuff, that the infant's actually in distress, but not showing it externally.
And they were often consistently or reliably punished for bids for attention or emotional needs. And so the baby learns to shut down their attachment function. And their exploration function is online. They tended to get rewarded with love when they explored. And so, that creates more of a focus on exploration, like disassociating from attachment needs. And they, and so you see more focus on exploration than relationships in dismissive, where, and they're often viewed as good children. Oh, my child never cries.
Yeah, it's rewarded.
Yeah. Oh, I have a good child.
Look how good he is, yeah. It reminds me of the famous English expression, children should be seen and not heard.
Yeah.
That kind of thing, yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely a dismissive cultural characteristic.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why all these developed. I kind of get curious, but in this sort of view, security is actually seen as helping someone suffer less.
Yeah.
The capacity to explore what's meaningful by earning security, the capacity to have reliable, consistent relationships with resilience in navigating conflict. So security supports those things, and in a culture where we're not, at war, at least on the land we're on, like we're in an environment where security actually is more adaptive.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And so if you're in an environment where it's not more adaptive, then it actually might not be, you might actually have some intelligent adaptive functions online.
Right.
And that's why it's important to get clear, am I perceiving an actual, threat, or is this a part of my history or a feeling memory being projected into my relationship today and exacerbating the source of threat?
Yeah.
And that's way more true for disorganized clients or disorganized children. So in the experiment, actually this disorganization wasn't in the originals. They actually excluded people who didn't fit into those three categories with Mary Ainsworth.
They discovered disorganized as an attachment style later on.
Yeah, it was actually one of Mary Ainsworth's successors, Mary Maines, who then started to classify some of these that didn't fit into the attachment categories that would freeze in front of their caregivers. And these are the ones who tended to have caregivers who were the source of threat.
Wow.
They may turn around and walk towards the caregiver. Or they do different things.
Like walk backwards?
Yeah. So they would do different things in the experiment to signify, the attachment function is online, but so is the fight or flight. That was originally unclassifiable attachment styles. And I'm sure there's more to it I'm missing. I'm not an expert in the strange situation.
Is it kind of like all the infants in the studies who didn't fit into those first three that you talked about get lumped into disorganized? Or is it that disorganized is its own category that makes sense in itself?
I think disorganized makes sense in itself. And, there's actually different kinds of disorganization. So people more on the dismissive end would be fearful, dismissive, where people more on the preoccupied end would be fearful, preoccupied. But a lot of models don't even include those distinctions.
So there's more distinctions that are made in the science of it,
Yeah, I mean, if you get into scoring the adult attachment interview, there's so many subcategories that aren't really worth talking about in this context because it would just be confusing.
Yeah, it's a lot of detail, yeah.
But, in short, the dismissive, because they were so dismissed, they actually start to then dismiss others. Because they were taught, because they inherited, I shouldn't create bids for connection. Or my bids for connection are implicitly wired to such profound emotional pain that when I create a bid for connection, it co-rises with this emotional pain. To heal that, we actually have to go in and be with some of that history and actually create new possibilities in the internal working model.
Yeah.
Totally.
Well, so I'm going to try to articulate something which to some listeners or people it's probably maybe seems obvious, but to some people it might seem like a bit of a leap. So we observe these attachment styles in these infants and there's these amazing scientific studies and it's documented. And then there's this leap to being an adult in intimate relationships and the idea that these same attachment styles show up in our intimate relationships with our partners as showed up with our caregivers when we were infants. And that connection may not be that obvious to some people, but I think for therapists in the field it becomes the water we swim in, so we just kind of almost take it for granted. But
totally. Yeah,
you could debate that or disagree with that or not believe that, but it seems to be true.
Especially with intimate relationships.
Yeah, right. So and that's a place where I think Freud was onto something that he deserves credit for. That we actually do seek our to some degree, our parents, so to speak, our caregiver in our intimate relation, because that's the source of nourishment, of intimacy, of connection, just like we got from our parents.
Totally.
Right? Yeah.
And, he also was a part of, at least in the Western culture, popularizing the unconscious. Which are in other cultures as well in different names. But
right.
And the body-mind connection. He talked about somatic symptoms that were being related to as physical illnesses. But he's like, no, these are somatic expressions of mental illnesses. And that's a whole nother rabbit hole. But we then moved away from that some with behaviorism and different, trying to get psychology recognized as a science because of cultural wars, but he had actually a lot of great stuff that still pervade psychology today.
Absolutely, yeah.
These actually do show up in your intimate relationships, for sure. I mean, I kind of feel for some of the partners I had before I did some of this work. I don't think I was ever like an atrocious partner or anything, but I was just like, man, if only, like my first girlfriend, I was so clingy. And I had no concept of how, when your sense of meaning in life is related to your relationship, how much pressure that puts on the other person. And how much that creates a lack of security, actually.
We all have to grow up one way or the other.
For sure.
Yeah.
And in friendships, it's a little less intense, but it's still there.
That's a good connection too, yeah. So it could show up in friendships too.
Yeah, especially like our experience with family in communities. I see that one, that's sort of an edge for me. Like, there's a part of, I grew up in a divorced family, and, I was not kicked out of my elementary school, but collectively, my parents and the school thought it'd be better if I went to a public school because it was a private school, and I didn't really have any larger family. I would see them maybe once or twice a year, but I had 7 cousins that lived 4 blocks from me that I've seen 3 times.
Wow. Yeah.
Like,
that's actually a big topic that I've thought a lot about, and I think so many of us in this modern world in America have a lot of wounding around community and belonging and attachment in ways that we're not, always conscious of, but that if we wind the clock back historically, we evolved to grow up in these small groups, tribes, villages, where we knew our neighbors, our family was all around. We tended to be born, live, and die in the same area. Yeah. And so I think that a lot of us actually have trauma, maybe not a big T trauma, but little T traumas from you were 5 years old and your family moved across the country, or you were 10 years old and you moved to a different school, or you went to college. And a lot of people, when they leave home and go to college as an undergrad, they're 18. That's a huge transition that's really challenging for so many people.
Totally. Especially people who were stayed in the same area the whole time and haven't moved around at all.
These big moves, these big transitions, and the lack of community, a lack of continuity, a lack of being seen.
Totally. And it's interesting, the way I relate to communities is I'm just like, I'm just not going to expect that much, I'm going to get what I can from the people who are here, which came more from the impact of mentors I've had on me and certain friends and things like that. But as a cohesive whole, I never anticipate communities working out. A lot of that for me, I've realized, and in some sense I'm realizing as I share, how much that was driven by like, my family was around, but not around. And, my mom provided a lot of emotional support or a certain sense of believing in me that has left an impact and other things. So individuals have had some support, but, I just noticed that, even doing this, knowing as much as I know, that doesn't change the implicit, unconscious, internal working models that we don't realize are fabricating our perception of self and world. And so, we have to keep going back in and starting to investigate how are we organized experience. And that's a part of, how do we imagine other people? How do we imagine ourselves? What thoughts, images, feelings, emotions, perceptions are coloring our world. And that's actually the start, too, of a developmental leap. It's when we can start to have this metacognition of our perceptions, of our thoughts, of our feelings, and awareness comes online. Because before that, awareness isn't online. That's something I'd love to talk about another time, is development. But that metacognition is actually a huge part of what leads to repairing the internal working model. Because before that capacity for metacognition is online, it's only internalizing relationships that we start to heal. But once we start to develop this metacognition, then we can actually go in and start to like reprogram our insides. So for someone who doesn't have that capacity, you might want to develop metacognition first and then reflect the qualities of secure attachment.
So is, when you said awareness isn't online, is that metacognition? Is awareness?
Consciously recognizing awareness isn't online. And it starts to kind of come online because we become aware of our thoughts, aware of our feelings, where before we were the subject of them. And so now awareness is the subject. And those thoughts and feelings that before were us are the objects we're investigating. So when that starts to come online through mindfulness or through these other qualities, then we can actually start to create these more wholesome qualities.
I love that. It makes me think about, like, in terms of mindfulness practice.
Yeah.
If you, a lot of people, I think, hear about mindfulness and meditation teachings in such a way where you just see thoughts as thoughts. Okay. But you can also, like, witness your thoughts and kind of investigate what kind of mind produces that kind of a thought. What is the worldview?
Yeah.
What is the way I see the world that creates that thought? And that's what you're speaking to, and that's really valuable to get that metacognition.
And I think now is a great time to introduce 3 of the ways I categorize what we're working on in therapy.
Nice.
Or in myself more than anything. I mean, I do this with people, but like, I don't know how all other therapists are, but a lot of it is like, what work have I done on myself? Because I tell people, I'm like, I became a therapist because I needed so much therapy that I decided to do it for a living.
Nice.
I mean, I'm kind of being facetious, but I dropped out of school, I had trouble exploring, I had difficulty in relationships. And a part of what got me really into attachment styles, to go back to what you're saying though, is what really saved my life and was the first thing that felt deeply meaningful to me was meditation.
Beautiful.
And I put all my eggs in that basket. I mean, for 10 years, I didn't have any extended vacation at all. And every vacation opportunity I had, I spent in retreat.
Wow, yeah.
Like, literally for 10 years.
Wow.
And ended up being like over a year with time accumulated. And now I'm kind of relaxing and going into a more relational style and a different way of relating to meditation. But meditation didn't really directly target my attachment style. It didn't target my internal working model.
That's a fascinating point, yeah.
So there was some, and keep in mind, it's a very just purely internal practice for the most part. I mean, it's supposed to impact our relationships, but how many teachers are not showing up in wholesome ways? Who have pretty much only invested in those paths, in those practices.
Right, so it's part of what you're speaking to, that meditation practice can obviously emphasize something like retreat and being with yourself in solitude.
Yeah.
And so then you're not practicing in relationship, showing up mindfully in relationship.
Yeah, and then, well, not only that, think about that whole way of, that's just a thought, that's just a feeling. There's a subtle dismissive air.
Yeah.
So a lot of dismissive people end up getting into meditation.
Yes.
Because actually they feel more comfortable not being in relationship. And actually, dismissive people tend to be more cognitive instead of emotional. And so it's a way of actually dismissing emotions, dismissing relational needs, being safe in that particular mindset to sit, the mindset of the dismissive. And preoccupied people can have more trouble with that. But I feel more preoccupied, and I just got into it by pure luck. I just had some mystical experiences from psychedelics, and I really wanted to understand what the fuck happened. And so I came across Ram Dass. He taught me about meditation, listened to some Alan Watts, read some different books, serendipitously met a meditation teacher.
Good old Alan Watts.
Yeah.
Maybe a great meditation teacher, philosopher, but maybe not a best model for healthy relationships.
Exactly. So this is the thing is, I feel like I pretty much only invested in that criteria, this inner work. I knew trauma. I didn't even give a shit about healing trauma. At the time. I wanted to transcend.
Right.
And I had moments of transcendence through practice, like experiential things. And it was actually a way out of my pain. And it wasn't until I came across more of the somatic teachings of like Reggie, who I feel has his own, attachment stuff, it seems.
Reggie, right?
Yeah. But, from how that community fell apart. But, I don't know as much to feel comfortable making any claims. But I will say that the somatic stuff started to get me more in touch with owning my body, and regulating my emotions, and having a different kind of transcendence that included the world, included my body.
Beautiful, yeah.
And so we can see, it's so interesting to see all these teachers who have difficulty with their relationships, and it often involves when people's certain needs come up, them being dismissed.
Yeah. That's a rich topic. I really appreciate you raising the question. And I think maybe a lot of people go through a phase, different phases, but a phase of immersing yourself in the inner work, and that could be beautiful and valuable, not dismissing it at all. To use that word, dismissive.
No, the most important thing in my life and continues to be.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah. And you can add the relational pieces and the connection. And the other thing I was going to say is something I've noticed in some spiritual communities, I'm more familiar with Buddhism, but you can really get into it and the practice and the meditation, and it's beautiful. And then when you are engaging in the world, you're trying to practice compassion, but it's this kind of conceptual, I'm having compassion for you, and it's not, it doesn't always feel very good or authentic, or it doesn't feel like the real thing, right?
Yeah, so it's cognitive.
Real love, it's something different than it's cognitive, and it's kind of has that dismissive quality, I think, at times.
Totally.
Yeah.
And also the thing with dismissive, they tend to idealize themselves, and they also tended to idealize their caregivers. And so they'll say, I had all my food paid for, or all my food taken care of, a roof over my head, what more do you need? Well, there's a lot more that a child needs for developing healthily. And by healthy, I mean in a secure way. But when you investigate and ask them, well, in what ways were your parents good? They tend to leave superficial answers, but then you start to be like, your mom was actually extremely judgmental. You actually had to conform to what she thought you should do, not what you authentically wanted to do. There's more of a sense of presentation, in dismissiveness. So I want to present a particular way. And if the child doesn't agree with the perception that the parent is presenting with, then they're actually punished. So your view of me is actually dismissed. And if you don't conform to my view of me, idealize me, then I'm actually going to withdraw love and punish you.
Wow. Yeah.
And actually you have to conform to my view of what you should do for a living. What I think, and a lot of this is well-meaning too. It's you need to become a doctor or a lawyer so you're successful and have money.
Right.
Which is also probably born out of a scarcity trauma.
Yep.
In a certain way. And some wisdom. A healthy adaptive function that may no longer serve its purpose in society today.
Yeah.
In some places it might.
I was going to say, if someone, I see some of this in myself, and then some people I've worked with where if you ask them, what do you remember from childhood, your earliest memories, and they're like, it was good, it was fine, I don't really remember much, I don't remember much details before the age of, 10 or 12 or 15. It's, I think that is connected with this dismissive attachment style you're talking about.
Definitely. So emotions are often a part of what gives memory its oomph.
Oh, yeah, that's a good
point.
Yeah.
If people who are more cognitive and less emotional, they actually tend to have less memory.
Less memory, yeah.
Or if it's so traumatizing that they disassociated the memory. So you would see that more in someone who's disorganized versus dismissive, where they have a narrative not really connected to most emotional memory. And, I'm also like, there's so much more I could say about all the different styles. my notes feel more concise and
this has been a great overview though, which is exactly what we wanted. It's been awesome.
Totally. And I do want to go briefly into healing the different styles and going back to the inner work. So the inner work still is what we do to heal our styles. We actually are trying to start to relate to these styles in us so that we don't keep showing up in ways that perpetuate, unfulfilling relationships, And the 3 ways I categorize the work are repairing the internal working model. So relating to those parts of our selves, to those mind states. So the preoccupied mind state, the dismissive mind state, the disorganized mind state. Starting to relate to those mind states from the qualities of secure attachment. And start to give those mind states honoring, wow, you have evolved for adaptive reasons. You helped me survive an environment, or maybe you helped my parents or my grandparents survive this environment and it passed through into me. We don't know why we are the way we are. And just honoring them. Not shaming ourselves for having relationship struggles. So it's actually a quality of feeling soothed and reassured. And so the 5 qualities of secure attachment, which we want to relate to our parts from when we're doing attachment repair, are first safety and protection.
That's the most fundamental.
Yeah. Because if you're not safe and protected, then the next ones are not as relevant. They're irrelevant. So if we're trying to hurt a part of ourselves, we're trying to actually, or shame this part of ourselves. Like that part is not safe or protected inside of us. So first, safety and protection. It's safe to be here to that part of ourselves. The second one is feeling seen and known. So, this is where in relational work, couples work, they say, reflect back what you heard the partner say and give them an opportunity to correct you. We're actually practicing being seen and known. And we're actually, practicing seeing and knowing the other. Some people have trouble actually letting in that they're seen or known because it's unreliable. So they defend against it, moments of feeling seen or known. So,
that's a big one, right?
Yeah.
That's what we want in order to experience intimacy. Be seen and to be known.
So the heart and intimacy are deeply connected to the quality of secure attachment. So being seen and known. Soothing and reassurance. Being soothed and reassured is the 3rd quality of secure attachment. And the 4th quality, so, if we're soothed and reassured, then it's okay to be anxious. It's not, I love you when you're not anxious. I love you when you're secure. It's actually, that's actually a quality that leads to insecurity. Because it's dependent. Actually, if I know I'll be reassured, I know I'll be loved, even if I'm insecure. Because we all do that. Secure people aren't just like, oh, I'm confident at everything. It's like we all experience these qualities of humanness. It's just there can be a sense of resilience and perseverance, and then it's not the dominating feature of their personality, their identity. It's actually a challenge that they feel they work through.
Nice.
So soothing and reassurance was the 3rd. The 4th is delighted. Just for being who you are, I delight in your presence. So people with preoccupation actually have more trouble just delighting. Often, it's said. That's kind of not been my personal experience, and I asked for feedback from friends, and they were like, yeah, I don't experience you as not delighting in me. But in certain literatures, people with preoccupation tend to be, since they're more in fight or flight, there isn't that ventral vagal delight, where dismissive may be a little less activated and not as openly critical. It can be a little more charismatic in certain ways.
Well, that's such a beautiful quality to highlight, and such a beautiful teaching that you can hear this and you can start to cultivate that in yourself and your relationships.
Like the Brahma-Viharas of attachment. Brahma-Viharas, for people who aren't into Buddhism, are like the loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, and sympathetic joy. But it's just the qualities. A lot of these I feel like are the qualities of a mind at ease with itself.
Nice.
Quality.
Like it's a natural thing that can just spontaneously emerge in the presence of someone when you're in that state.
I think potentially. It's just, so much of it's speculative for me.
Sure, yeah.
Because how many of those people have never heard these teachings or never done these practices and have all those qualities, So it's somehow the view creating it too.
Yeah, that's interesting, yeah.
But, so not unconditional delight, but being delighted in is the fourth quality. And the fifth quality is supported in your genuine exploration. And it's genuine because preoccupied people tend to sacrifice themselves in order to obtain proximity because they regulate in relationship. So they may do something that's not authentic because they just want to be around someone.
Right.
So that dominates. The relationship dominates over the exploration. Where dismissive people may not give a shit if you want to explore with them or not. They're just going to do their thing, and so if you want to come along, fine. It's not a collaborative thing. They actually want someone who's going to sacrifice themselves for their needs because they dismiss needs and they expect you to dismiss theirs. And if they do show up with a need, and you do dismiss it, it can really evoke pain in a dismissive person. Or they'll just shut it off and not even realize how much pain they're in.
Or, it makes me think like the more dismissive type would, if, they don't think their need is going to be met or it's rejected by the other person, then they try to meet it in themselves in some way.
Potentially, or they just distract from it. Because they tend to regulate not in proximity, but they never learned how to emotionally regulate themselves, so that doesn't turn into self-regulation. They actually distract with work or drugs or activities, or they attach to objects instead of people. And we learn to regulate our emotions from our caregivers initially, or through some other means.
Yeah, it gives the whole attachment theory and all this gives a lot of insight, I think, into addictions.
Oh, for sure.
It could be an addiction to work, like you just said, but of course, addiction to substances and getting
or
your needs met or distracted from those needs through using substances.
And disorganized and dismissive tend to correlate with more addiction than preoccupation.
Interesting.
Because preoccupied reached out to relationships, so maybe they aren't attaching as much to the objects or the mind states. Or dismissive, relationships are more the source of threat, and on the continuum are farther. Well, some people categorize dismissive as easier to repair than preoccupied. So Dan Brown's work suggests that, where Diane Poole Heller says the exact opposite.
Oh, yeah.
What's interesting is Diane Poole Heller's work seems to be more relational, where Dan Brown's work tends to be more focusing on facilitating the relationship of the ideal parent figures with those qualities of secure attachment relating to the wounds that you evoke in the visualizations. So the visualizations work with procedural memory. Somatic stuff works with procedural memory.
So it sounds like what you're saying, Dan Brown's work is more a kind of process you would do on your own, so to speak.
Well, you can do some of it on your own, but because we tend to be visualizing the ideal parent figures from the schemas or internal working models that we have, you can he suggests that you can accidentally reinforce insecurity. So, for instance, I did some of his protocol, and I visualized my dad taking over the drum set and showing me how to play the drums, and then I didn't realize that was actually him dominating my exploration. And
just in your own imagination.
Yeah, and then the person facilitating me, I started feeling a sense of security with him, but my exploration function was still shut down because I was watching him play the drums, and it wasn't like he was showing me and then now pushing me to go play. It was like a different energy in that particular visualization, and I didn't even realize what I was doing, and that was a schema that I was operating from. So so you're supposed to have someone secondary tracking the, are the 5 qualities of secure attachment being modeled by the ideal parent figures to this part. or are we accidentally reinforcing insecurity or disorganization?
Oh, interesting.
But my view is a little different. I have found a lot of success inwardly with my own, since my own heart, and really caring about my parts, and that is more the IFS view, is that all those qualities are already inherent. And they talk about whatever, the 6 C's, 8 C's, I can't remember right now, but of self-energy. But the point is, all these inner work qualities, whether we're doing forms of shamanism and having protectors come to us, or, Didi yoga. Like, I've heard one psychologist, John Churchill, who graduated from Naropa, also did a lot with Dan Brown's attachment stuff, meditation teacher, say if he has students with attachment issues, he just tells them to go do Didi yoga, and where the Didi starts to relate to these parts that are embodying these different qualities. Yeah. So we'll give them more like a white Tara or something like that. Heard him say it in a podcast somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've heard that idea of, it was new to me a few months ago, I think, or however long ago, but that attachment work could relate to something like Didi yoga, that could be part of the Buddhist tradition in that way. It's an interesting idea. I mean, it's not, of course, the Buddhist tradition doesn't talk about it in those terms, but in terms of connecting with a figure of love, of light, that's more, has more qualities and is more relational than just an abstract kind of ultimate reality, if that makes sense.
For sure.
Yeah.
And it also gives an image, or an starts to shape the internal working model of how to show up in relationship. It's a little more of a relational image than a formless object, or a formless, undescribable nature. I think summing up, maybe we can go quickly into how to work with different types, like just things different types can sort of look out for while they're working on themselves. So I digress a little from the 3 qualities. So it's healing the internal working model, mentalizing, which is also just self-awareness. So becoming aware of your style, becoming aware of your impulses. So for instance, people who are preoccupied tend to have less cognitive awareness. They tend to de-emphasize the cognitive knowing. So strengthening their cognitive qualities can actually be helpful. And also being able to hold, when I'm in a preoccupied state where I'm clingy. Also, people who are preoccupied tend to not be collaborative when they're outraged. So due to this own there's a sense of moral outrage in a relationship. So they feel justified in not collaborating with the other's needs. And if they're in fight or flight more easy and it's harder for them to calm down, it might be harder for them to collaborate with the other's needs, which also reinforces the dismissive's experience of my needs don't matter. So this collaborative relationship is the third thing we want to track and work on.
Collaborative relationship, wow, yeah.
So knowing your style helps with the mentalizing. Knowing, I am, dismissive, it actually would help me to have more emotional awareness, to actually sit with my emotional numbness until emotions come up, or generate positive emotions, or access them in therapy through different experiential techniques like sensory motor or IFS or things like that. Internal family systems, for those who don't know that. And then with disorganized, it's actually creating a sense of safety in their experience. And being able to mentalize, or become aware of, this past trauma that I experience is coming up. That actual self-awareness of our styles is a part of what helps us engage our styles, and is one way that we can actually start to collaborate in relationship too.
So, another way to say what you're saying is that your style, which was the subject that you were identified as, becomes the object. You start to notice, this is my disorganized attachment kind of showing up in this moment, in this relationship, in this way. And then you don't have to believe it. You can name it. You can relate with it.
Yeah. In sensory motor, they talk about dual awareness. So it's harder for people with severe trauma who haven't metabolized it, or who are regularly activated to actually have that awareness. So, there are measurements that say disorganization have the least amount of mentalization capacity, or
interesting.
Preoccupied or just under. And actually, because the dismissive had to monitor themselves more growing up, they had to actually keep their mouth shut in a way. They actually learned to monitor their thoughts and feelings a little more than preoccupied did, but they actually shut down their emotions. So, where disorganized as a dominant feature of is more distraught regularly. So for the preoccupied, because it's so those three categories, just to rehash as we go into this, are preparing the internal working model, mentalizing your self-awareness, and collaborative relationship skills. So they all start to intersect with each other. Where because of how you can collaborate in relationship and bringing people in, you end up actually creating corrective experiences in relationship, which shift your internal working model.
It's shifting the way we see things, right?
Totally.
I'm kind of having this thing pop up in my mind around if there was like a kind of hardcore businessman or someone like that. I don't know if they would have made it this far into this podcast conversation, but if your goal in life is to make as much money as possible and you want your son, your child to do the same, obviously that's not what we're talking about here, but from a certain point of view, the dismissive attachment style of performance-based relationship and being in the world and kind of tamping down your own emotional needs and pursuing this external goal, it totally makes sense. And it's obvious that our culture and other cultures have encouraged that.
Yeah, definitely.
Right? Like a lot of successful people, I wonder, this is the kind of therapist in me, if they are pursuing these external goals and hiding their deeper emotional needs and wounds, and that's part of what's driving our world, but they actually see it as a good thing. They're so out of touch with their emotional reality.
That's what they're valuing. That's what they were taught to value.
Yeah.
So, look at Elon Musk. His wife let out an interesting video commenting on one of his ex-wives, on what it was like to be married with him. And then, I don't know what impact he's having, but with the impact of smart cars and other things, there's a part of me of like, maybe there's room for all of it in some way.
Yeah, that's part of what I'm getting at, that someone could take all this in and they could say, well, I'd still rather have some Elon Musks in the world if we're all super secure and relatable, and there could be like less, of that kind of drive. But the other flip side of that is this kind of consumerist, extractive, capitalist thing is devastating our world, and it leads to so much suffering. So,
and it's misattuned to what people actually need.
Yeah.
And I get curious, what level of fulfillment do they have in life, and things like that. And
I think another example is something like sports. Like take someone like Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
And I don't know him personally. I'm just using him as a famous example. But someone who's so competitive and so driven and would sacrifice everything to win, and he did win. And we celebrate that. And good, he's the best basketball player that ever lived. And what is he like to be in a relationship with? I don't know.
And there might be people who have very successful explorations and still collaborate in their relationships and have meaningful marriages. I'm sure that's out there.
Yeah.
And, there's definitely room for all of it, and I think it's just more, I feel like offering this as a way for people who do want to work towards meaningful relationships and and are in a place where they can do the work to let their nervous system relax and to open up to new ways of being. So I think just 2 tidbits for each style to look out for and to cultivate in their inner work and work with others is with the preoccupied in relationship. There's something called a nourishment barrier. So it's hard for them to calm down. Even if they're getting what they want, because their needs were often met when they were dysregulated and in an unreliable way, they don't calm down, even if someone new who is more reliable comes in. It might, for me, I actually had to work on letting in the love I was looking for from my girlfriend. And this is very recently. I've been working on myself for a while, and I remember like a few weeks ago sitting with someone and just saying like, wow, I noticed because I'm afraid of losing that love. I don't know if that love from her is reliable. It's hard for me to actually let it in and let it nourish me. So for people who are preoccupied, this trouble calming down is a part of that. So can we let in 5% of our needs being met? You know, and that calms the critical voice. And, you know, and also working on self-regulation, like the ability to be our own inner harbor, our own regulatory force, where our parts turn towards us instead of the other as primary. So we become our primary attachment figure, and our partner becomes secondary. And so that self-regulation really helps with that, and then you get the ventral vagal system, which is inherently relational, and a little more capacity to contact, like compassion and care. So that self-regulation and nourishment barrier is really big for preoccupied work. And with dismissive, and I kind of just want to roll through these real quick because my brain's starting to fade.
Yeah, I've been going.
With dismissive, it's really getting their emotional world back online. So their emotional life and being able to express themselves genuinely. So they were often, you know, it's almost like a flat affect in connecting with people who are very dismissive. It's like, oh wow, I can tell they're not like really relational right now. Like there's some flatness happening. So connecting to their emotions, being able to feel the pain of being dismissed and connecting to the impact that their childhood had on them. And being able to own their relational needs and express that and collaborate with others. Start to tolerate that other people have relational needs. Because that can create a disgust in them because they had to be disgusted by their own relational needs.
Wow.
Or they had to push it down. Maybe they weren't disgusted by it, but, you know, it was poison for them growing up in a way. So they have to start owning it and expressing that in relationship. So in some sense, dismissive have a much more relational journey because they, and preoccupied have a more inward, like, oh, let me regulate myself, because we're starting to cultivate the opposite. You know, with preoccupied, they also want to work on, you know, their own authentic exploration instead of just being close to people. And dismissive need to work on their relationships a little.
Right. That makes sense.
And not being as focused just on their own personal exploration if they want to earn secure. And, you know, I personally wouldn't want to be in relationship with someone who isn't collaborative in relationship or concerned with my emotions or my needs if they weren't working on themselves. So I rule out and don't associate with people who are dismissive and not working on themselves as a pretty dominant feature of their attachment system. And especially in intimate relationships, I would screen them out very quickly if they weren't working on themselves. But even in friendships, like...
Yeah, because they're not going to be able to connect emotionally, relationally. In an interpersonal way. And, you know, there's sometimes, like, you know, I was thinking of someone who I know through the juggling world, who I learned so much from, and they were dismissive, but I wasn't there for a personal relationship. I was there to learn juggling. And so it was more tolerant, but it wasn't a sustained, lasting, meaningful relationship. That's a good example,
You know? So,
what if someone's listening to this and they're saying, well, I want to be able to choose which relationships I open up to, you know, in a more secure way, and then I actually want to be able to choose to be more dismissive in some, like, it's like...
Actually, I mean, I would argue it might be more secure, because with secure, we just have certain boundaries. We also just have a certain chemistry. There are secure people out there that I want nothing to do with. Not because they're bad people. It's just like, we aren't jiving. For whatever cultural reasons, personal reasons. I mean,
that's okay too. And
it's not a symptom of there anything being wrong with us or them. It's actually like, I don't have the time or energy to be friends with everyone and everything.
Right.
It's like I have a limited time on this planet. So that actually would be a symptom of secure, because we would just assume, oh, my certain needs aren't being met here, and they'll be met somewhere else. So of course, you know, the secure just assume their needs will be met somewhere, if not here. And they can repair them. And, you know, I just want to name real quick, we keep talking about secure like it's the ideal. Well, a part of the issues that secure need to work on, it's actually because their internal working model is what it is, sometimes they have trouble understanding why people have such difficulty in relationship. And so then they sort of screen out people they could have very meaningful relationships if there's a little more empathetic understanding in why people have the difficulties they do.
Yeah. Well, no.
And then they could actually positively impact people, which some of my secure friends have for me.
Okay. Yeah. I'm also imagining, if you were raised in a secure fashion and you have a basically secure attachment style as an adult, it doesn't mean that you don't need to do inner work or you can't benefit, so of course it doesn't mean that, so.
I find those people boring. I mean, that's judgmental. That's a part of me I need to work on. I even said that to my girlfriend last night. It's like, I got to work on my judgment when people aren't interested in working on themselves.
That's a value that you have.
Yeah, for sure. And for the final repair for disorganized, I mean, really finding the right person to support people in their work, because disorganization, if it's severe, is a little more difficult to do on your own. There needs to be a little more guidance. I mean, we can have disorganized parts we're working with and stuff like that, but for people who are severely disorganized, they have such trouble, being reliable in work and exploration, and relationships are often very volatile or non-existent, very fearful, avoidant. And it's really creating an inner safety in themselves, starting to connect to protector energies in themselves, or connect, I'm such a parts work emphasis, but, in Diane Poole Heller's system, when you're starting to do some trauma work, some relational trauma work, you might bring in a protector. So that actually might take them out of the situation. So just starting to really lean into just starting to create ways of being safe and protected in yourself. And, some of the strength of disorganized is they're connected to the suffering of the world. Not everyone is privileged enough to be insecure, let alone secure.
Right.
And there's a deeper suffering that many people are just so, disconnected from. And I think a lot of some disorganized people too, they have trouble monitoring themselves, and they just spout out all of a sudden, they're talking about a deep trauma to a stranger, and they're like, whoa, what the fuck was that? And so they screen that person out pretty quickly. So even creating some sense of monitoring, understanding, some sort of social expectations in different contexts can be helpful. But I think what they're doing is they're trying to get people to understand suffering, the suffering in the world. I don't know if that's a conscious drive, and this is just theory for me, but I do think there's a connection to a deeper suffering, so there's some, and I think that's more of a worldly drive in them. It's to connect people to that, have people know, to feel seen. They're trying externally to get soothing, and so that's why I think having a therapist that understands disorganization can have some sort of patience for some of the struggles of what sort of feeling memories come up that are then projected into the therapy room or onto others. Because a lot of people actually just get so overwhelmed being around people who are disorganized because of the deep depth of overwhelm inside of them.
Right.
So it really takes, I feel like, support or, blessings, or if we're doing it on our own. Or by blessings, I just mean some people do experience spontaneous major healings.
Sure.
So I don't want to rule that out as a possibility, but I think the relational aspect is really important for disorganization.
Yeah, they can find a relationship maybe with a therapist that can see them and hold them and not run away or not be overwhelmed, not be thrown off.
Yeah. Meditation teacher, I mean, it comes through in all sorts of ways. But
Thanks, that was really well said. A lot of good food for thought and good information and good teachings for everyone.
Totally. Thanks for having me. If anyone has any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I love talking about this stuff and linking people to resources. And
awesome. Yeah, I'll link your website in the show notes.
Cool. Thank you. And then my little notes will be in there too. too, that I wrote. They're a little more concise than I had over the however long we've been here, but yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me, Julian.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for listening to another episode of A State of Mind podcast. I work here in Boulder, Colorado as a therapist, coach, and meditation teacher. You can learn more about that at my website, astateofmindcounseling.org. And you can learn more about the podcast at astateofmindpodcast.com. Any donation is greatly appreciated. You can support the show directly at patreon.com/astateofmind. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you here next time.